So, we're beginning today with the panel, Unfit Parents and Science. And the first one on the floor is Martin Kuhar. Martin Kuhar is a senior research associate at the Division of the History of Medical Sciences of the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts. His professional interests include the history of medicine, history of eugenics, and medical ethics. He also teaches the philosophy of medicine at the School of Medicine, Catholic University of Croatia. And with the title Eugenics in the Independent State of Croatia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for inviting me. Good morning. When I started doing my research in eugenics in Croatia, everyone and anyone asked me, but what about the independent state of Croatia? And it's all the more natural, because it is a well-known fact that during this period, from 1941 to 1945, several legal provisions which are grouped under the so-called racial laws were enacted in the independent state of Croatia. It is also an undisputed fact that Serbs, Jews and Roma in this period experienced unspeakable suffering. What is disputed in the literature is to what extent the Ustasha extermination policies were racially motivated. I think that even if it was the case, it would be, it is a separate question. What about strictly medical eugenics during this period? And I also think that if it could be proved that there was a eugenic policy during the independent state of Croatia, it would also corroborate the argument that the extermination policies were somehow biologically or racially motivated. And it's all the more natural to ask ourselves that question because in Germany, eugenicists, including numerous doctors, participated in creating and implementing eugenic policies from the very beginning of the Nazi rise to power. The policy culminated in the so-called Action P4 euthanasia program, under which approximately 300,000 people whose lives were considered unworthy of life were killed in September 1939 until the end of the war. Previously, it was thought that it was only at the beginning of the war. This included disabled children, with which the program actually started, but it later expanded to include people with disabilities, the mentally ill, the epileptics, the mentally retarded, the elderly in nursing homes. One of the organizers of this program was Hitler's private physician, Karl Brandt, who was executed, as we perhaps all know, in 1948 as part of the Nuremberg trials. So, the eugenics practices exist in Croatia during the independent state of Croatia, and did Croatian doctors advocate its implementation, and if so, in what way? My assessment, so I'll start with the conclusion. My assessment is that eugenics in the NDH period shows much more continuity than discontinuity compared to previous periods. The main characteristic of population policy during the NDH period was a focus on quantitative improvement. For example, in 1942, the head of the Ministry of Health, orthopedist Mladen Petras, wrote that, I quote, "A nation that loses its biological mass, a nation that degenerates physically and mentally cannot endure this struggle for life. It perishes and disappears from the world's battlefield." However, this biological strength did not have explicit hereditary components. The importance of having children was emphasized. And women were encouraged to be good mothers, good housewives, and a return to a patriarchal regime was promoted where women would fulfill their biological duty of being mothers and good wives. Again, the main topics by physicians when talking about this biological mass were those from social medicine, actually, such as the fight against infant mortality, malaria, and in Bosnia against endemic syphilis. The focus on quantity was most strongly expressed in the very strict law on the prohibition and punishment of induced abortion and on the interruption of pregnancy from June 10, 1941, so at the beginning of the NDH period. It specified penalties for doctors, midwives, and others who participated in carrying out abortions, as well as for pregnant women themselves. A pregnant woman who performed an abortion on herself or had someone else perform it was punished with 5 to 10 years of prison, while a life sentence was prescribed for people who caused or performed an abortion on a pregnant woman at her request. The for performing an abortion without the woman's knowledge was that the law clearly specified that the pregnancy could be terminated, and I quote, only for the purpose of saving her life or averting an unavoidable danger to her health when this cannot be achieved in any other way, end of quote. In other words, eugenic indications for abortion were not permitted. As Primarius Adrian Seligli noted immediately after the law was passed, social and eugenic indications for termination of pregnancy were rejected because, and I quote, a precise limitation and definition of a social indication is almost impossible, and the eugenic one often lacks a sure scientific basis, end of quote. Doctors in professional literature supported these political stances and decisions. For example, in January 1942, Ernst Mayr, who was then head of the pediatric clinic at the Faculty of Medicine, which he actually founded 20 years ago, wrote an article in Liječnički vjesnik about the link between abortion by curettage and Down syndrome, or what, as he called it, mongoloid idiocy. He was prompted by a letter from the Archbishop of Zagreb, Alojzij Stepinac, to doctors regarding the issue of illegal abortion. Mayer's approach consisted of linking two theses. First thesis is that Down syndrome was appearing more frequently in first-time mothers, especially in the cities. And the second, that the parents of children with Down syndrome were often intellectually gifted. So, based on the fact that, as he calls, the so-called intelligent circles rationalize natural birth more than other people, Mayerhofer hypothesized that abortion procedures by curettage could lead to changes that could eventually lead to Down syndrome in later pregnancies. To prove the thesis, he extracted data for 54 children with Down syndrome born at the clinic in 10 years period. The data showed that 39 children with Down syndrome were from the city and 15 from the countryside, although the population was mostly rural at the time. And the ratio of first-born children with Down syndrome to later-born children was somewhat higher in the city than in the country. To prove the causal link between curettage and Down syndrome, he provided several case studies from his own practice. And he postulated that the uterine lining was not sufficiently recovered for normal nidation later after the curettage, so he recommended the doctors to inform young couples about the great danger of this procedure for later offspring. He also warned of the general racial hygienic significance of unindicated curettage, arguing that the fight against illegal abortions was of great importance for the racial hygiene. He calls it the racial hygiene of the people, similar to how the German Reich issued a number of laws in that direction. A good example of the attitude of tracing doctors towards abortion in the NDH period is the work of pathologist and forensic expert Edward Miloslavic, who was rather well regarded at the time, because from 1920 to 1932 he was in the United States, where he served as the chief medical examiner for the state of Wisconsin and as a professor of pathology and bacteriology at Marquette University. And from 32 to 54, he was a professor at the Department of Forensic Medicine at the Faculty of Medicine, where he founded the Institute for Forensic Medicine in 1935. He was the dean also of the Faculty of Medicine 6 months after the NDH was established. Miloslavic, in one of his lectures, characterized abortion as an unnatural, harmful, and dangerous phenomenon that causes the inevitable ruin of the populace. He characterized it as a disaster for marriage and that it permanently endangered the woman's mental and physical health. He believed that one could empirically verify it just by looking at Soviet doctors and how their permissive attitudes towards abortion actually led to the ruin of a nation. For Miloslavic, a rural Croatian population, which was, he said, mentally and physically healthy but uninformed, was listening to contemporary destructive ideas propagated by a criminally inclined pseudo-intelligentsia. Until recently, Catholic morality, he said, had prevented the appearance of abortion, but now pseudo-sociologists, I quote, pseudo-sociologists with their eugenic propaganda and explanations about the need for so-called rationalization of sexual life and childbirth, and doctor abortionists with their social indication in favor of their own pockets, are spreading deleterious ideas among the people about the importance and need to artificially remove the fetus, allegedly for special reasons or to prevent pregnancy, end of quote. According to Miloslavic, the eugenic indication for terminating a pregnancy was completely unnecessary and therefore unjustified. On the other hand, eugenics had found its true field of action in health propaganda, which would instruct young people to avoid the poisonous pleasures, such as alcohol, drugs, nicotine, that have a harmful effect on the sexual glands because they otherwise contribute to the development of unhealthy and abnormal offspring. Furthermore, they must be aware of sexual diseases, especially syphilis, which in parents cause severe somatic and psychological degenerations and then in their own children. So clear Lamarckian thinking about the inheritance of acquired characteristics, which was actually prevalent in Croatia or the whole Yugoslavia in the interwar period, except for the 1930s in Croatia, where Boris Zadnik, actually a Slovene biologist, supported the Darwinian view by adopting this idea of Weissman plasma. If you know, the Weissman plasma actually postulates that inheritance is done only by glands, sexual glands, and not by somatic cells. So this was kind of a return to the Stampar's thinking about the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So how was this education about the deleterious effects of alcohol and other poisonous pleasures done? Well, as part of a project to raise hygiene awareness in rural areas, clinical assistant at the University Clinic for Children's Diseases in Zagreb, Nada Kovačević, traveled throughout Croatia to learn about these conditions that mothers give birth to and raise their children. Based on the travels, she concluded that the biggest problem with population policy was actually the ignorance or primitivism of rural population. In 1944, she reported that the basic vital strength of the Croatian people is good, meaning that 9 out of 10 children are born healthy, but high infant mortality of up to 15% actually nullified a good portion of the high birth rate. She also stated that propaganda was trying to convince young marriage candidates that physical and mental quality are an important part for success in life, especially because it reflects on the offspring and affects the future generation more than the material goods brought into marriage. Again, this idea that the marriage should be a union of two healthy individuals rather than two capitals. This propaganda was carried out as part of healthcare for mothers, infants and young children, specifically in certain sections of the General Directorate for Health, children's homes, counseling centers and clinics for sick children and children's dispensaries. Various courses for mothers was also held with lectures and visual materials. It is certain that this education on the importance of parents' health for producing healthy offspring was based on a voluntary basis. It wasn't enforced. Unfortunately, there is no additional information about the content of this education. It is just stated that it dealt with, but because there was this previous attempts at propaganda actually tell us something about what it could be about this. For alcohol, do not drink, do not smoke, choose a healthy partner, stuff like that. In addition to the strong emphasis on quantitative population policy, as I believe I just explained, the NDH period also saw the emergence of the first more detailed psychological anthropological research. The psychologist Zoran Bujas conducted one of those. Bujas performed tests at the Vocational Guidance Center, which his father, also a psychologist, helped found in 1931 within the Institute for the Advancement of Crafts of the Chamber of Commerce. On over 1,000 boys who were brought to Zagreb to be assigned to commercial and economic vocations. After measuring their intelligence, the Bujas performed anthropometry on two groups of boys. One larger group of about 700 boys that were homogeneous in intelligence, and the smaller group composed of 83 very intelligent boys and 71 intellectually less gifted boys. Bujas saw the possible connection between any physical characteristic that he could think of and intelligence on the other. With this, if you wanted to see if one variable, for example, an anthropometric one, could be used as a basis for predicting the intelligence. Bujas calculated correlation coefficients, and by knowing these coefficients along with the mean and the standard deviation, he used linear regression to actually provide any statistic thinking. Well, this graph tells the story by itself. He found no diagnostic value for any of the anthropometric variables. Head length gave only results slightly better than random guessing. According to Bujas, nothing could be concluded about intelligence from head width and skull height either. For the relationship between intelligence and head circumference, he admitted that conclusions about the intelligence of the owner cannot be made on the basis of the size of his head. Furthermore, he found that most of his subjects were brachycephalic, meaning they have a little bit wider head than the longer. It's a bit wider, and that means many Croats are of Dinaric race. However, he did not claim that this is because of the racial composition of the Croatian people, because he postulated that it could be due to rickets, due to malnutrition, because rickets, which is a sickness that affects those who have a lack of vitamin D or calcium, it causes a disturbance in bone mineralization, so the head has a tendency to go in a brachycephalic way. And also, perhaps a hard pillow, he says, which is a common occurrence in poor regions like Herzegovina and Dalmatia, where a good portion of his subjects came from. So, he also wanted to determine whether brain mass could say something about intelligence. It was similar, he said that it could not even be an approximate measure of intelligence. And this is the graph of intelligent and less intelligent boys, and it's almost a complete overlap in his test. So he said that even if the overlap was slightly less than this, there was a difference. Again, individually you cannot predict anything. Perhaps the most interesting part of Bujas' research was the testing of physiognomy, or assessing intelligence based on reading faces. You are provided with a face and you have to say about the intelligence based on how someone looks. For this purpose, Bujas engaged 30 judges aged 18 to 45, mostly students and clerks, who were given photographs of selected subjects. Some of these I show here, and to assess their intelligence. For each judge, the correlation coefficient between their list and the actual intelligence list was determined individually. So the correlations varied from minus 0.25 to 0.518, with an average correlation of 0.109. So, in Bujas' words, judging intelligence by a photograph is almost as accurate as guessing randomly with your eyes closed. So, although very rare in Croatia, these types of anthropometric tests, which were actually published during the Antić period, it wasn't suppressed in any way, it was actually done professionally, don't provide support to the claim that it was possible to derive any psychological characteristic like intelligence based on anthropometry, which was the case in other countries. Bujas even questioned the supposedly hereditarily based characteristics of the Dinaric race. During the independent state of Croatia, Milan Đukić, who was an internist and anthropologist, was the sole physician who actually had the official position on. He was actually in medical faculty in Zagreb. He later became a docent at the Institute for Human Genetics and Eugenics in 1943. His views on race were rather more nuanced than his predecessor. His predecessor, as I said, was Boris Zarnik, who actually had this very strong hereditary determinism ideas about inheritance and about races, especially in the urban countries. But Đukić believed that races were not pure and were largely a function of environmental pressures. He argued that it was difficult to identify racial markers and dismissed any link between race and cultural achievements. According to Đukić, cultural attributes were primarily shaped by the environment, not by individuals' racial background. When defining eugenics, he defined it classically, so we have a domestication due to civilization, therefore there is no pressure, there is no selective pressure, so we perhaps should do something to combat that. He divided eugenics into two main categories. One was social eugenics. This is the policies that improve the overall population, such as anti-abortion measures, financial assistance for parents with multiple children, and supporting the peasant class. The peasant class was always seen as a source of regeneration of Croatian people. And the other was individual eugenics. It focused on personal lifestyle choices, premarital counseling, and measures, perhaps measures like sterilization or prohibiting marriage. Đukić differed from his colleague Boris Zarnik in his more cautious and pragmatic approach. While Zarnik was a staunch Darwinist who rejected inheritance acquired traits, Đukić was more reserved about this. He acknowledged that certain phenomena in paleontology were difficult to explain without some form of inheritance of acquired characteristics over the long periods. And even today, this is just a small parallel. Today, we have this resurgence of Lamarckism through epigenetics, right? So his practical application of eugenic theories was often individual-based rather than dogmatic. The state has to enforce something. For example, he evaluated a divorce request in one case based on eugenic concerns about whether the child could be born with some sort of defect, and he concluded that the risk of child inheriting a condition was too low to justify the divorce. So his approach was more individual than social. Đukić conducted extensive research. He did, however, say that throughout generations, even a recessive characteristic could be expelled from the population by sterilizing those who have the disease. But it would take a long time to get to 0.1% of the RR. Those who are diseased. It would take 100 generations. Because it was the obvious objection. Once we know about the dominant and recessive characteristics, many said, well, since we have heterozygotes that have the recessive gene, but they don't have the disease, how are we going to stop the recessive diseases? By sterilization. It cannot be done. He actually wanted to show that it could be done, but it would take a long time, and he didn't call for the introduction of that in Croatia. Another of his research was an anthropometric study of over 1,000 individuals. He cautiously correlated brain weight with intelligence, but concluded that this link was only statistically significant for large groups and could not reliably predict an individual's intelligence. That means that if you have this and this, perhaps, so you have an overlap that is so big that individual, you cannot predict to which group one belongs. He advocated for sterilization and marriage bans for criminals, but did not translate these views into specific radical proposals for the whole population. His overall approach has a degree of academic caution and a call for interdisciplinary cooperation, especially with geneticists and clinicians. So this is Đukić. And to conclude, the main point is, unlike Nazi Germany, the Ustaša regime in NDH did not have a systematic, radical eugenic practice of forced sterilization of euthanasia. Nothing like it. It even prohibited eugenic abortions. The focus was on quantitative rather than qualitative improvement, because the quantitative improvement was needed in the age of war and due to high infant and child mortality. The physicians actually supported these pronatalist policies and health hygiene rather than genetic selection. Psychological and anthropological tests that I have showed questioned the basis of racial theory and its application to whether the dynamic race was hereditarily determined. So, although the racial laws existed and the extermination policies were there, I believe, were not based on hereditary determinism. It was based on political and other reasons rather than some racial blood ideas. Because we, even in previous periods before the NDH, the Croatian eugenics rarely dabbed into those fields such as racial thinking. It was mostly concerned with, I don't know, tuberculosis or criminality and stuff like that. So, thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for this very interesting speech. And now I will introduce Antić. I'm very happy that she and the next speaker are here. They are my supervisors and my colleagues at the University of Copenhagen. So we already a bit merged this collaboration between the university, our Faculty of Arts, and your interesting university. And now let me introduce you. Anna Antić is a social and cultural historian whose research focuses on the history of modern Europe and its global connections, the history of war and violence, and the history of the sciences. She has authored 2 monographs, Therapeutic Fascism, Experiencing the Violence of the Nazi New Order, and Non-Allied Psychiatry in the Cold War, and is currently completing the 3rd one, Schizophrenia, Primitivism and Modernity, reimagining the 20th century. So this is also connected to your current research. Her research interests revolve around the relationships among psychiatry, politics, and violence, as well as the decolonization of psychiatric practices and concepts in the second half of the 20th century. She's a professor of European history in the medical humanities at the University of Copenhagen, and where she heads the NLF Center of Culture and Mind. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just trying to figure out this. Okay, so now for something completely different. I'm, as Anna said, I'm a historian of psychiatry, and I'm working on this book on schizophrenia, this research on the global history of schizophrenia and the way schizophrenia became a global diagnosis. And so one part of that, sorry, it's very romantic. Right. Okay. So a part of that is, of course, how schizophrenia traveled across cultures as a diagnosis, as a concept, but also a small part of that is how schizophrenia, how the role of families and the role of mothers and parents and motherhood was conceived in the context of the origins of schizophrenia and the context of schizophrenia's outcome, like how family was used to explain schizophrenia. And first I think it should be said in this conference why schizophrenia, why I'm talking about schizophrenia in this in a conference on motherhood and reproductive history of reproductive discussions of reproductive rights. First of all, schizophrenia is one of the most puzzling and troubling and perhaps significant diagnoses and concepts in psychiatry, as this recent book calls it, we don't say very well, our most troubling madness, schizophrenia, because there's been so, it's an extremely debilitating diagnosis, but also one that has struggled a lot with, one that psychiatrists struggled a lot with explaining origins and finding out therapies that are working. So, as Thomas Sass, the anti-psychiatrist, called it, schizophrenia is a sacred symbol of psychiatry, but actually it became a really symbolic, an important symbolic concept that really sort of opened up a lot of discussions that have to do with psychiatry, its role, its legitimacy, its efficacy. It's also very much part of the schizophrenia is also has been not just a clinical concept, but been really involved in really important for kind of broader social and political and cultural discussions, and it's been closely related to discussions about modernity. As some of you might know, schizophrenia has been seen as this badge of modernity, something that diagnosis that's only common in civilized societies and very uncommon in sort of primitive societies. But also discussions about schizophrenia are also discussions about clinical issues, about the role of psychiatry, but also about, it's a really useful for me in the book, a really useful window into accessing broader social, political, and cultural discussion and concerns, also about decolonization, about transculturality, but also about gender and family and the role of the role of gender, the role of family, the role of mothers. what makes a good family, what makes a healthy family, what's a good mother, what's a bad mother. And so it really tells us a lot about these major social and political shifts of the 20th century. This is what I'm trying to do in the book. And so for this conference, I think it was particularly important to talk about schizophrenia family, the schizophrenia family connections, because I think it has been, as you can see from all these books that were published from the 1950s on, the role of family and the function of the family in the kind of emergence of schizophrenia and in the development and outcome of the treatment of schizophrenia has really attracted a lot of psychiatric attentions and really captured the research on schizophrenia. What is a family? How do we deal with family schizophrenia? I mean, within the current, more or less biomedical model, schizophrenia is actually described in medical, biological, and clinical terms. But in the mid-20th century, particularly, the family is really the core of research attention. So the core of kind of mainstream psychiatric research in schizophrenia actually focused on the family, and as we will see on mothers. In the 1960s, these leading social psychiatrists in Britain and in the US, like Julian and have proclaimed that a family's relationship to the patient is the best single predictor of outcome in schizophrenia. This is very much the vogue of the mid-20th century. Research on schizophrenia is very much focused, as I said, on the family. This was the time in global psychiatry, so now it's kind of mostly English-speaking world, this kind of psychiatry that really influenced, shaped the globe. The research on, as I said, the psychiatry was mainly social and psychodynamic, with a lot of psychoanalytic influence, and very much focused on family. And on these concepts that I mentioned here, and I'll explain them in the course of the talk. So looking at what kinds of relations in the family might either trigger or kind of be completely responsible for the emergence of schizophrenia in the patient. They were looking at issues like emotional involvement, emotional expression, emotional relations, the kinds of behavior, the mother's behavior, the parents' behavior in their contact with the children, whether they were concerned, over-concerned, too cold, too warm, too involved, not involved enough. And I said the mother really emerges quite strongly. And so this is not the mother, this is the psychiatrist, Frida Thurm-Reisman, one of the leading mid-20th century psychoanalysts and psychiatrists dealing with schizophrenia. And I put her here, and she's not the only one, but she's one of the most prominent psychiatrists who in the mid-20th century came up with the concept of schizophrenogenic mother. You can practice that, schizophrenogenic mother. I have learned now the different languages. And this is the kind of so Reisman's quote really explains it everything, right? And so the schizophrenia comes out from this family, from these pathological relations in the family, especially with the parents. Is painfully distrustful and resentful of other people due to the severe early warp and rejection he encountered in important people in his infancy and childhood, mainly in a schizophrenogenic mother. In a very famous, so the schizophrenogenic mother is a very complex figure. So it's not just a cold mother or a distant mother. It's a mother that is extremely ambivalent in her emotional behavior. So she can be overly concerned, overly anxious, overly involved. But at the same, for a period of time, but then at the same time, or within the same person, she can also exhibit the very, very cold, rejecting, hostile, distant behaviors, right? So in Tuna Titz's article for 49, this is very well explained. So rejection and hostility, but also overprotection, right? Also over-involvement. Hostility and domineering attitudes, but also this kind of wholesale, extreme criticism of the fundamental traits of the patient, of the person. There's also somewhat of a role of father, the weak father who can't control the mother, but the focus is very much on the mother. And this is something something that actually was very important in the history of psychiatry and sort of the research of schizophrenia. It's still sort of, it still feels like it needs to comment on this, the episode of schizophrenic mothers. Because I think this kind of blaming the mother, blaming the parents, causes a lot of harm to psychiatry, and it's actually, it's rejected now. This body of research, this body of knowledge is kind of, as you will see, kind of rhetorically and rejected by researchers in psychiatry, but I think there's some interesting continuities in this. But I think so the most important thing here is the ambivalence, right? The double bind, right? So the mother that switches between these both rejecting, hostile, and overly involved, overly domineering attitudes. Oh God. So that the patient is confused about kind of what kind of behaviors are appropriate, and that really hurts their relationship with reality. But I think if we think about the 1940s, 1950s in particular, this is happening in the US, in the UK, and it's really influential around the world. So what does this focus on schizophrenic mothers and the blaming, placing all this responsibility for schizophrenia, for this awful, debilitating disease on mothers? What does this tell us about broader social issues and broader understandings of women, womanhood, motherhood, etc.? And in the research on this, of course, we do have, I think, important evidence to argue that when these psychiatric practitioners criticized the mothers, it reflected broader concerns about the changing role of women in the society, especially this is what I meant when I said schizophrenia really gives you an insight into these broader, very important shifts in the 20th century, so the historical changes, political changes, and especially the changing role of women. So you can read that from the psychiatrists themselves. They didn't hide it very well. No, so for instance, John Rosen says the schizophrenic mother is the one that suffers from a perversion of the maternal instinct, and that is the kind of somebody who, as Theodor Litz is a really, really important psychoanalytic psychiatrist of that time, is someone who rejects the traditional homemaking role. And one of his most important examples is this. In his cases, because they published case studies, a former career woman from a wealthy family who hated housework, so that was the schizophrenic mother. But it's also, so it's more than that, so it's more than housework and more than the role of the mother, and someone who's actually deeply ambivalent towards their own children, towards their own motherhood, right, and therefore exhibits this kind of double bind behavior. So that kind of explains the rejection, but at the same time, these will be domineering women, right? These will be very manipulative, domineering. So this is kind of where when you're very emotionally involved with your child, and you risk becoming a domineering and overly involved mother. And someone who, as I'll say, that who really undermines the child. And then here you can see, this is also a beautiful quote from Theodor Litz: a cold and unyielding mother will be more dangerous than a cold and unyielding father. So why, right? And so there's a different role of the mother and the father, and they shouldn't switch, right? They shouldn't change them. And of course, as you might expect, these mothers are particularly harmful to male children. This is mother that is unmanning the child, the boy child. She's directive, she's dominant, right? And here as well. So you have all of these characteristics that I mentioned, impeding the independence of the child, infantilizing the child, combining these uncombinable characteristics, rejection and over-involvement. But as I said, so anti-psychiatry in the 1960s, so R.D. Lang also worked with the concept of schizophrenic mother, but from a more progressive political point. But even then, it was they did define this rejection of normative femininity as the cause of schizophrenia. So this kind of feminist emancipation carries it with it the risk of schizophrenia. From wherever you stand politically. And so as I said, this is something that is a kind of a relatively short an embarrassing episode of the history of psychiatry, but an influential one. And the research that actually became much more, kind of is viewed as much more respectable in the history of schizophrenia is, again, focused on families, but it's a more a social psychiatry research that started from the UK, that wanted to look at the family, but not to blame parents like this, because this backfired quite badly, as you might imagine, especially from the point of view of families and mothers. And so the psychiatry kind of, there's a different kind of strand of research in psychiatry that said families are still really important and parents are still very important, but we're going to do this something different. And what they came up with, so this is much more of a moving away from psychoanalysis, which was like Reichman and this group, and looking at more kind of social science research. So the social science research into families, which was literally about measuring emotions, sort of measuring emotional expression. This was expressed emotion, EE research, very famous in psychiatry, that was particularly applied to schizophrenia, and argued that you can measure emotional, they call it EE index, like how to measure through interviews, through very, very detailed questionnaires, and then sort of applying these numbers and grading on the questionnaires, the grading of people's emotional expression, and observing families. Through these measurements, you could measure, establish this kind of the EE index, the emotional atmosphere, the index that measures the emotional atmosphere of the family. And the EE index is a complex instrument that I think in the end is comes down to these 4 elements. So they measure criticism. These are elements that are relevant for schizophrenia, right? So it's criticism, hostility, emotional over-involvement, and in the end, warmth and positive remarks, which actually becomes less and less important. So these people say we're not blaming mothers, we're not psychoanalysts, we're not working with the concept of schizophrenogenic mothers in these extremely pathological families. No? We're interested in commonplace, ordinary families. We're interested in, not in the origins of illness so much, but with the outcome, course and outcome of illness. We're not explaining schizophrenia as a whole. We're looking at families, not only mothers, but we're not, because schizophrenic mothers were extreme cases, and we're looking at families. But this is like something about family emotional relations and mothers that's particularly important. And so here I'll show you some cases, some quotes, right? So they start from, so this is kind of late 50s and 60s and 70s really comes into its own, and still goes on until now to express emotion research. So they start with this concept of dominant motherhood, right? And so this is a dominant, this kind of directive motherhood that they call it. The mother issued several orders to her son. Twice he walked out of the room and she talked, but she called him back, come here. She constantly referred to her son. And then there's another mother who is constantly correcting her son and cleaning him. Anyway, so this is kind of dominant directive motherhood. But there's also, so what they decided in the EE research is that this is very British, expected, the stereotypes live up to themselves. So they decided that high index of expressed emotion is particularly harmful. So the families with high EE are more at risk, rather, so people in schizophrenic, people who come from families with high emotional expression are facing a worse diagnosis, right? They're more unlikely to recover from schizophrenia. And so this involved this in directed motherhood, but also excessive criticism, hostility, and this kind of manipulative emotional involvement. And so these are some of these examples that they did UK and US families at this moment only. So this kind of complete rejection, wholesale rejection of everything that the patient does, and then a criticism not only of particular behaviors, but the fundamental characteristics of the patient, generalized rejection, hostility, like this one, I don't like to have him around, one mother says, right? I don't like to have him around, I don't feel that I should be responsible for him, etc. I want to get him out. He's not any benefit to himself or any benefit to society, any benefit to the family situation. There's always something with him, right? So this is, these are the things, and this is one of the more extreme examples from EE research. This is the mother of Geraldine, who is not actually hostile or hostile or excessively critical. She's just very, very manipulative and very selfish, right? And very much impeding the independence of her daughter, right? She says, she's always been at home with me, she's always willing to do anything, wouldn't want her to get a job, I don't want her to get married, I would miss her, I'm happy to have her at home, etc. And then later on, buried in this whole story is that the father is abusive, right? So that you should leave with that, I feel, like, you know, if you have a case study. Anyway, so this is what it is. And one of the leading, so in the 80s and 90s, no, this is 80s, one of the originators, George Brown, of this EE research, is kind of explained his kind of looked back, reflected on his scientific journey, and then he kind of distanced himself very clearly from the schizophrenogenic mother research. Says, I'm skeptical about this. He refers to the schizophrenogen, the psychoanalytic research. They emphasize enduring, deeply disturbed relationships. Such families were uncommon, unlikely. The occasional presence of deeply disturbed, unusual relationships between parents and patients should not be allowed to dominate their thinking. So it's really kind of distancing from that research strand. The way forward would be to develop an instrument capable of recording the range of feelings and emotions to be found in ordinary families, and that's what they did supposedly. But I think I want to argue, and I am arguing in the book, that in fact there are a lot of continuities in between these two kinds of research, and that the EE research was very keen to establish its own scientific legitimacy, its own distance from psychoanalysis, which was at this point disgraced, was really wanted to say that we don't blame mothers, we're doing scientific research with questionnaires and numbers, but actually they were working with very similar concepts, and ultimately I think it remained a tool to criticize Western families. So Western families were deemed to have very high EE indexes, especially UK and US families, and that was exactly what schizophrenic mother research claimed. So here we have the research, some of the research results. When they have prolonged contacts with their families, then they deteriorate, schizophrenic patients. 2/3 of those who socially withdrawn or avoided family members in the months preceding key admission were well at follow-up, right? So avoid family members. And the family members were key relatives, and key relatives is most often the key female person living in the household, most often the mother, and so this is about the mother. And Brown famously found that schizophrenic patients with working mothers did better because they didn't see them, they saw less of the mothers, right? So it's really quite interesting. And so, but if you look at the Frida from Reichmann, Julia Titze, Theodor Litz, all these people from the earlier psychoanalytic research, they worked with the same concepts, right? The directive, dominant mother, but became emotional over-involvement in the EE research is this kind of directive, domineering motherhood, manipulative motherhood, the same focus on excessive criticism, hostility, coldness, unyielding mothers, rejection, right? And so, and even though here we talked about families and not mothers, the mothers became, the mothers were most often the family that we talked about. And even in this kind of, this was a difference that the original schizophrenic refers to the origin, right? So the schizophrenic mother produces schizophrenia. And this research is claiming we don't know what produces it. We're just interested in the outcome. We're just interested in what makes people better. But actually the EE research also ventured into discussions and speculations about origins, and it was all about mothers. And so I think it's kind of really interesting how, and this much more respectable and the core very important part of research on schizophrenia is very much influenced by these conceptualizations of motherhood that, as we saw earlier, rest on concerns, social and political concerns about the role of women in society. The final twist, this is very final, is about culture, right? So this is then the research that started in the English-speaking Western world, but then because it was an instrument, it was a scientific instrument that was then tested cross-culturally, and then it was concluded that it's completely applicable cross-culturally. And this is the conclusion, interesting conclusion here, we now have evidence, and Nancy Waxler says, as an anthropologist who worked in Indonesia, that the prognosis for schizophrenia is much better in non-industrial than in industrial societies. And that means that the EE index, that what they found that this expressed emotion index in non-Western societies is much lower, and therefore the parental relations, but also the family atmosphere, emotional atmosphere, is much more helpful for the recovery of the schizophrenic patient. So the mothers in the developing world, in the non-modern, you know, they call that non-modern world, are much better for schizophrenic patients. And then this is the hundreds of studies were done across the world with that conclusion that it is like in the Western context across the world, this EE index is the predictor of relapse. It's really interesting the language that gets used. I like how the Ljubljani is a very well-known psychiatrist. Until recently, a strong case can be made for a real pervasive influence of a powerful factor, which can be referred to as culture. And so culture is very important because culture reduces the risk of schizophrenia, or increases the chances of the positive outcome of schizophrenia. But as we often talk with Shilpi, so India becomes this playground to test all these different theories in the times of decolonization. So these are actual references to India. A lot of the early studies were done in India, where families are found to be much better, much better for schizophrenic patients, and the prognosis much better. Recovery chances in India, in other places like Nigeria, Colombia, where they did studies much better than and then the Western mothers are particularly bad. And so this is, this is the language. So this is the second quote is from two Indian psychiatrists, very well-known Indian psychiatrists, and says subjects in this region, they were doing it in Accra, right? In Agra, not in Accra, in Agra, get good family support. There are a few demands on them. No domineering mothers. The fact that in India a few families are nuclear, so it's traditional large families. Maybe another reason for better outcome, coping behaviors on the part of both family members of the subject that are much better, much more appropriate. So, and there was this argument that the conflict, the relations are not complicated ambivalent in developing world families. Families are not sites of violence and oppression in these. Here we have research from Chandigarh in India, large kin-based households and networks in which a sense of the importance of family bonds induces relatives to assume responsibility, remarkable tolerance for different symptoms of schizophrenia, family masculine. So this kind of the idea is this traditional family, and this is very complicated because this goes well beyond gender and understandings of motherhood. It's kind of the whole, it really tells you a lot about how these people understood the world and this relationship between modernity and the other, whatever is the opposite of modernity, how they saw decolonization, how they saw the former colonies and their relationship to their own relationship to these colonies, right? There's a lot of assumptions about what traditional and primitive world is. And now this is all couched in a very positive language, like they're better for schizophrenics, but there are lots of assumptions about simplicity and primitivism and what is a traditional family. But it's interesting because the problem was the mother who was more emancipated, I think, in the West. The change, the mother who's more ambivalent about motherhood, the mother a woman who rejects the traditional role, and then the India or the developing world is the preserver of these traditional mothers and traditional roles, and they're much better for schizophrenic patients. And so that's kind of but it comes down to sort of gender and culture, which kind of all come together in this particular understanding of the world. Okay, and that's it. So I don't have a conclusion because it's an ongoing project, but some things to think about for me and perhaps for us as well. When we talk about motherhood and women and expressed emotions, what is the meaning of these EE indexes or even schizophrenic motherhood without understanding the cultural context? So what is the culture? What is the cultural context? What do we mean by that? And how then the meaning of these emotional relations and family changes accordingly? Can we have a universal instrument measuring emotions without the cultural context? Also for me, this is very important because I'm kind of also a historian of decolonization. So how do we get to these models to these different models of parenthood? Really harmful model in the West, and now suddenly very, very positive, imagined traditional model in the developing world. And Susan was saying yesterday something about primitive mothers who are better, like who don't feel pain, who don't complain so much about childhood. And this is this idea of these natural mothers in the non-Western world that are much better. They're much closer to the natural role, the natural, authentic woman's role in society. Can we study this? And I keep asking this: can we study these global relations without these assumptions of simplicity, complexity, without hierarchies? Psychiatrists find it hard to think outside hierarchies. But also, I mean, this for me is still progressive research. Progressive research in social psychiatry, psychoanalysis, psychodynamic research was actually quite innovative and politically also progressive. And so how do we square this? How do we understand? Yeah, how do we acknowledge or understand the importance of the progressive aspects of this research, understanding the social and cultural determinants of health, etc., and their very, very conservative take on gender roles and gender politics. So, thank you very much.
But now, let me introduce you our next speaker, Shilpi Rajpal. Just a moment. See here. Can you find? Thank you. So Shilpi Rajpal is primarily a social historian of psychiatry at the Center of Culture and Mind at the Department of English, Germanic and Roman Studies at the University of Copenhagen. As we already heard, her project, Decolonizing the Mind, birth of the global mental health movement in India from the 20s to the 80s, traces the local, national and global histories of psychiatry in colonial and post-colonial India. Her book, Curing Madness, A Social and Cultural History of Insanity in North India, was published in 2020 by Oxford University Press. It focuses on both institutional and non-institutional histories of madness in colonial North India. In her work, the terms madness and cure are explored as shifting categories which traveled across cultural, medical, national and regional boundaries, thereby moving beyond asylum-centric history. And Shilpi, with the title Motherhood and Mental Hygiene, Movement in India, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I will not talk about decolonization today, and I will also not talk about my book. This is something in between what I ended up doing, and this was somewhere the end of my PhD where I got this archive of the quarterly bulletin of the Indian Association of Mental Hygiene, and that really made me interested in this particular very short-term movement, but how it impacted a number of things, including things like opening of the first psychiatric outpatient clinic in India, the emergence of psychiatric social work, the surge of interest in psychology and psychiatry, and also tightening of notions about sexual hygiene. They all intersected with mental hygiene. Before I move on to discuss about motherhood and question of domesticity, child welfare, and I will first try to contextualize mental hygiene in India. To give you a very general overview, this is a very general overview which I think everyone would know here, how mental hygiene came into being. But mental hygiene particularly, what I find very fascinating is that how it, hypothesized that a psychiatrist was needed much like a priest in channelizing the inner self. The notions of mental health were tied to the controlling and guiding of emotions, habit, time, and energy. So how the idea of preservation of mind became so core to the hygienist and what it does in the colonial milieu, a colonial milieu in the sense of India, what happens there, because these notions really fitted well with the colonial mindset where there was no impetus to do something or to, even to expand psychiatry or, so these idea of preservation have a very different and a very interesting afterlife, which, my paper looks into. This paper is largely, my paper and the discussion I'm going to have is largely based on the quarterly bulletin. I delve into like a micro-historical method where I try to understand, especially this movement, and this movement was the mental hygiene movement which originated in the United States, but by the 90s, which originated in the United States in the 1909, was something like a savior movement, like so it's going to save people from mental health issues. It's going to preserve them from not only awareness but also the idea of hygiene, of the awareness of not marrying the wrong partner was so important, which again came from eugenics and how it not only penetrated mental hygiene but also family life and motherhood, which I'm going to discuss, and the last section which I'm going to quickly look at also is the question of child guidance, how these things are so interconnected in the picture of mental hygiene. But this movement was intimately intertwined with colonial structures, personnel and ideas. The necessity of mental health policies and mental health infrastructure was often elaborated by the British psychiatrists who worked in the mental hospital in India. And here particularly, before I go into much detail, it was Berkeley Hill who was the main person behind the Indian mental hygiene movement. He was the superintendent in charge of the Ranchi Mental Hospital. He's a very peculiar and interesting person. He marries a so-called low-caste woman. He studied in Oxford, in Göttingen, and he's a very fascinating character because he has a lot to say about several things. Though of course we will focus on motherhood and question about family life, but he met Freud, in his like a little meeting. But there are interesting discussions about him following this word in the small word of Ranchi. So he's particularly very crucial for the issue of positive eugenics, and the notions about improvement of race also were very crucial at this movement, not only for the colonizer but also for the colonized, because this is the time when, especially the 1930s, when this quarterly bulletin is also coming out. This is also the time when there are journals called Marriage Hygiene which were published from Madras at the similar time. So there is the idea of sexual hygiene and mental hygiene somewhere overlapped, and that makes me think about the question about family and the idea about family hygiene in that sense. How, for me, what becomes very important is how the question of positive eugenics, how it linked to the question of family life in regularizing the role of motherhood and ideas about marriage, childhood, mental deficiency in India. So how family life became the center of these arguments is something what I'm going to discuss in a little bit of detail. When talking particularly about India, and particularly in this period, it is a period of anti-colonial struggle. India is already facing the ideas about degeneration in a very different way, like in a way that it's an age of, where they want to revive the body and mind in order to fight the colonial onslaught of not only colonization but also the fear that they are degenerating. So there's a scientific, and I'm not getting into the social history, the depth of the social history at this moment, but I'm trying to give an overview. Number of reformist ideas in this particular movement go back, to do the ideas about their own Vedas and how Vedas were the source of knowledge. So how revivalism and reform went hand in hand in society when we think about mental hygiene. What I'm trying to also say here is, when on one hand, mental hygiene is a language which was known all over the world, but what India adapts and what happens at the level of the, this journal and publishing, which is a very small, collaboration in a certain way of the educated, elite, civilized, scientific, emerging middle class, but also at the lower level or the level of the popular or the people. What is happening is these ideas of reformist and revival of the Hindu golden age is so core to this. So the ideas of becoming a monk, and it's extremely complicated, and I'm not delving into that thing, but in the Arya Samaji discourses, Arya Samaj was one of the main reformist movement, which there is a discussion about what motherhood means and how important it is to educate the mother. So mothers had to be educated, but at the same time, they should not be educated to become the mem sahibs. So the fear of becoming the mem sahibs were pertinent, as Antić referred also about the educated women. But at the other level, what we clearly see is, how the ideas about domesticity, which were so pervasive to the family life here, and here I quote, particularly, we can see here, sick nursing, maternity work, child welfare and social work are some of the channels of sublimation of women. Community service, hard physical, labor, games and sports provide paths for men. Now, Banarsi Das was superintendent of the Agra Mental Hospital, and he was he became the editor in charge after Berkeley Hill. So these ideas they create the hierarchy of a family life where there is a clear role of a father and a mother to be played, and if they do not, then it's going to crumble in a very serious way. So these fears are rationalized by the scientists, and how they penetrate, and how I think what is very important argument for me here is how psychiatry and domesticity were not very different, how psychiatry and domesticity overlapped during this period, and how discourses of domesticity, were so important in the making of a father, a mother, and a wife and a husband. Because if a father cannot control the wife, a mother cannot control. So that entire Victorian ideas about domesticity are replicated in the voice of psychiatrists, and that is very, very clear during this period. This is also the period when we see that how India is particularly attacked by this, by Kathleen Mayo's text. Kathleen Mayo was an American journalist who wrote this book called Mother India, which was published in several languages. And so because India was attacked because of the child marriage, and how India was shown that it is, especially in the 1930s, how India is not fit to rule itself because of the way they treat the women. So these are discourses which are happening at different level, but mental hygiene particularly, how important it was for, again, how the education of father and mother is so important in terms of making the house, homemaking is particularly important. Motherhood particularly, and here I would really like to quote how the fear of unruly mother was so clear. How will they become disobedient wife and wicked mothers if they were not good homemakers? So the good homemakers have to be very important, and they clearly come out in these psychiatric tests. I want to really, show this through Berkeley Hill's work. Berkeley Hill's, while describing ideal motherhood, and I think I do put it here. Yeah. But yes, while describing ideal motherhood, he says another type of maternal horror is a woman who is ashamed of being a woman, the tomboy grown up. It is she who tells her daughters never to marry and never to trust a man. It is she, jealous of the male, who turns away from the little son, who runs to her naked, saying, "Fie, cover it up." Women's conception of maternal and homely was reinvented in the mental hygiene literature, and psychiatrists and prominent British psychiatrists at this time clearly argued that how a crop of healthy, hearty and intelligent children depends on mother, and this again is how family is worth saving, and to save the family it has to be the mother who has to be the forefront, who has to take care of the environment. If she fails, then the entire family fails. So this is where exactly, and this in certain ways is also an attack on the political, social, sexual and psychic life of Indians, which was under the tight scrutiny, which I have already discussed, particularly during this period because of Catherine Mayo's work, which the representative image of the child bride in degenerating Hindu and entrenched the colonial narrative of political and social spheres, how Indians are nothing more than child brides, and how the degenerating Hindus, and this again has a very deep rhetoric when I talk about degenerating Hindus. For me, it creates several images and ideas about this constant fear of semen loss from the 1930s to, like the literature I have gone through, but it precedes much before from what I'm aware of from the 1880s. Loss of semen, which meant loss of nationhood, and which also was very pertinent in Gandhi's ideas about his fears of losing his manliness, of raising right men so that they can save the Mother India or the Bharat Mata, which was so important. So home was thus the microcosm of nation, and the family life was vital for the stability of nation state. The family had to be preserved by the new legal framework and also the psychiatric framework, which was overlapped with these languages of psychiatry and psychology. Sexology became a guiding light to reform these Indian sexual practices. So there is no difference in terms of there is this close connection between sexology and psychiatry as such. Okay. What was also, I will quickly go through the next two sections, but what is also very important in this period of time is this time is how child welfare was so important for the colonial discourse, how scientific motherhood becomes the important things, how mothers were considered to be uncivilized, and not knowing, ignorant mother, the discourse of ignorant mother. So not only the educated mothers were attacked, but a little before was also the ignorant mothers were attacked. And this is again happening because of the ideas of mothercraft, and there was an entire dictum of when and how a child has to be fed was so important at this period of time, how again the ideas about community building, about nationalism were linked to the ideas of child welfare and family planning. And again, it is extremely important how these ideas get further linked in these discourses about from when the shift happens actually from scientific motherhood to child welfare to family planning, and how psychiatric discourses actually penetrate and and actually define the contours of these movements is so crucial in this period. and in the last particularly section, I wanted to discuss about the child guidance movement. The child guidance movement again was very crucial, and somewhere this movement is the movement when mother blaming becomes so clear, that this movement was meant somewhere to prevent the problem child, to prevent the hardened criminal. But in case of India, how this was also a question of class and caste, particularly the question of, again, juvenile delinquency overlapped within the discourses of mental hygiene, and how mother was portrayed as the central problem in these texts is very important to understand how these discourses not only were in certain ways at that moment, but they also continue to be discussed. And just to conclude this, I would like to also point out how I was just reading this work by Elena Singh called Bad Boys, Good Mothers, about ADHD. So how these ideas, not only perhaps from my research and what I have understood, the shift from scientific motherhood to child welfare to family planning and to the child guidance movement, where there is this core of this troubled child, the image of coming and the role the mother plays becomes so crucial, and it keeps shifting a little bit in different literatures of psychiatry, whether it's ADHD, schizophrenia, or this juvenile delinquency. But it's very interesting to discover how these shifts occurred in the 20th century. Thank you.
Now we have not so much time for questions, but I think that all our speakers inspired us, so the floor is yours. And yeah,
can I ask when we will to do the next panel? Because it's in 10 minutes? Because if we do it straight on, I would like to put my PowerPoint on the computer.
No, I would rather do the question now for this panel, and then we have a short coffee break, and then so questions? Yeah.
I have a question to you, and I was wondering, super interesting, I was wondering how much this notion of schizophrenic mother is tied to attachment theory, and if you see, in this discourse I feel it's very much focused on the mother, which is still very prevalent, and I would ask you to, your opinion, are those notions still prevalent, or is this just my opinion, or my take on this psychiatric discourse?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's part of the same, obviously, it's same discourse, the same sort of body of knowledge. I don't think Bowlby published that much about schizophrenic mothers, so I don't think there's a difference. But there is, of course, they're very conservative interpretations of the attachment theory, and that's been used for very conservative purposes, I guess, and the mother. And I think that nobody would speak about. I think this has been very profoundly disgraced. That nobody would speak about schizophrenic mother. But as I said now, or in the context of attachment theory, but I think some of these concepts still live, and the responsibility and how you apportion responsibility politically in the family, right? I think that's. I would say there are lots of continuities, but I'm not. I'm not actually a specialist in psychoanalysis, so we have a colleague who answer much better. But yeah, I think it's problematic, and it still lives. But again, it's about the framing, because I think this schizophrenic mother discourse actually is very much originating in the US, and there's something, the US psychoanalysis at this time was in fact quite conservative in terms of gender and sexual politics, and so that is one. So you can also frame it, family, mother relations. You can frame it in a much more progressive political context, and then it's very different. Its implications are different.
Yeah, another example is the mothers of autist child, and in this sense, is even much more linked to this holy idea of symbiosis and so on. So the idea of autism, generic mothers. Yeah.
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 But it was
Autism,
the
generic
diagnosis.
mothers. Yeah.
Yeah, they were they like separated later.
Two quick questions. First, those British psychiatrists who claim that somehow being more emotional can lead to schizophrenia, were they attempting to corroborate these claims by researching the incidence or prevalence of schizophrenia in more temperamental countries? People are more emotional by themselves. My second question, this was how much of a mainstream was this schizophrenic mother, and were there opponents of this in terms of biological psychiatry?
Yeah, of
Okay.
course. Yeah, I think it was. Well, because this was also the U.S. really messed this up, because in the U.S. the psychoanalysis and psychodynamic psychiatry became very much mainstream in the mid. But this was also in the mid 20th century, and that was also because of the Second World War and I mean, of course, the effects of the Second World War that I think biological psychiatry couldn't quite cope with, but also biological psychiatry was disgraced in the Second World War. So it was complicated, but I think it was, I would say, mainstream for a period of time, but then with a lot of opponents. And these people, the UK people, were also the opponents, on the surface, right? And they wanted to distance themselves, certainly biological psychiatry. But now if you read kind of mainstream histories of psychiatry, this is very much criticized, this is very much rejected as this kind of there was no evidentiary support, as there wasn't. But with regard to temperamental countries, I think it's interesting because they I don't know what their temperament, but I think everything that was not Western was better. And it's so interesting how. And then there was this research that actually is quite good, solid research, anthropological research into Mexican-American families. Very famous anthropologist and psychiatrist who did this, and also found much better emotional index in Mexican-American families. But they had to I think this is what it means, that the cultural context, they had to redefine it. So what is considered overly involved in a different context? What is considered hostile, but not the hostility is defined differently across these different contexts. So, but I think the temperamental countries fare better somehow in this research.
So, yeah.
Last question.
Pressure.
And I just keep in mind all your questions, and we will return to the last session with the remaining ones. So, yeah.
I have a question for both Shilpi and Anna, and maybe it applies to all of these really wonderful papers, which is this tension between developing expertise and yet celebrating sort of primitive and natural. Like, so, mothers just can't get a break. Like, they have to follow all of these things coming from the top down, and yet the ideal thing always falls back to some kind of natural, instinctual, sometimes in the literature primitive. So, like, women can't catch a break, but I'm also just wondering about how you see that tension playing out in your sources, right? Like, why do we need to tell women how to do this thing they're supposed to understand how to do, and then the problem is modernity?
Yeah. Well, if I can just jump in right in, you pointed out this contradiction that really in eugenics it exists, because the village was supposedly this source of regeneration, because people had multiple children, a natural way of life. But then again, they were uneducated. They ruined their children by not applying hygiene, by not cleaning enough, by not ventilating their houses. So you have this tension between, okay, it's a source of the regeneration, it's a natural state, but then again, it's rooted in some dated practices that need to be exterminated. So we should apply some urban ideas, but when people come to the cities, they don't have children, they turn to alcoholism, they turn to prostitution, they end up in factories where their health deteriorates. So you have always the question, the tension between this natural state and what should be done.
I think it's quite close to what he's saying. So the question about the ignorant mothers, the houses of illness, that how, this idea of exactly the mothercraft, which this guy, Truby King, and what I find fascinating about him is he was a superintendent of asylum, so he's putting the routine, because routine was so core to the mothercraft, which was also so core to the moral management. So, are you trying to manage, so how emotion, but how this returns, actually that when you look at, in my paper also explored, but a little later by the 40s, particularly Susan Isaac, or her name was known as Ursula Weiss, she became very prominent psychoanalyst who replied to, so she says that, do not ignore your instinctual, don't let the baby cry. If the baby is hungry, you have to comfort them. So these theories keep changing at different point of times, and this idea of the craft and the scientific motherhood is an imposed regime which actually doesn't go so far. That's what I think.
So it's also very politically expedient. I'm struck by how the problem in the 1930s, when it was politically expedient to prove that India can't rule itself, and the problem was the primitive motherhood, and a few decades later, the problem is the modern motherhood. Yeah, it's